The director laughed when he saw the boy's worn-out shoes and discount store shirt. "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here," he mocked. But when Marcus touched the keys, the room fell silent. This is the moment a community center keyboardist proved talent has no zip code. Marcus sat stiffly in the waiting room chair, the hole in his jeans pressing against his knee. He kept his legs crossed at the ankles so no one would see. The conservatory's marble floors shone under crystal chandeliers, reflecting so much light it hurt his eyes. His mother's words echoed in his head. "Just play like you do at home." But nothing here smelled like home. Other students shuffled their sheet music wearing tailored jackets and leather shoes that didn't squeak. A girl nearby adjusted her pearl earrings while stretching her fingers. Marcus counted 3 designer logos in his line of sight before he stopped looking. The freshly laundered shirt his mom had stayed up pressing scratched against his back. His sneaker made a wet, squeaking sound when he shifted, drawing glances. The receptionist kept looking over her glasses at him instead of the paperwork in his file. Marcus could see her eyes trace the faint bleach stain on his sleeve, the same one his mother had scrubbed for 20 minutes trying to remove. The weight of the sheet music in his lap felt like the only real thing in the room. He'd practiced these pages on the community center keyboard for 7 months straight, even when the space heater broke last winter and his fingers went numb. Some nights he'd stayed until the janitor kicked him out at closing. 78% of the students who got in here came from neighborhoods with houses Marcus only saw on bus rides home. He knew the numbers from Mrs. Alvarez at school, who believed in his audition enough to help him apply. "You play like your heart's on fire," she'd said. Then she'd given him bus fare and told him to keep the change. When his name was called, the folder nearly slipped from his sweaty hands. The receptionist tapped her pen on the application. "Best of luck, Marcus," she said. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. Someone behind him whispered something sharp that ended with, "Charity case." Beyond the door, the audition room smelled like wood polish and expensive perfume. A grand piano waited under a cone of light, its lid propped open like the mouth of some giant creature. For one terrible second, Marcus forgot how to breathe. Then he remembered the way his mother's hands had trembled signing the field trip permission slip, the one that let him skip school for this audition day. That was when his shoulders straightened. All those hours practicing scales with Mr. Rodriguez's old metronome counting time didn't disappear just because the floors were shiny here. The clock ticked loudly as he walked toward the piano, past the judging panel where 3 serious faces waited. The one in the middle, Petrov, his nameplate said, had already started scribbling something before Marcus sat down. His jeans stretched tighter over his knee as he adjusted the bench, the hole at risk of exposing itself if he moved wrong. Marcus set his sheet music on the stand, watching how the light caught the pencil marks where he'd written fingerings. He wondered if anyone here had ever used a paperclip to fix a broken sustain pedal like he had at the center. The door clicked, shut behind him. No going back. Oak Street had never had a student accepted here before, but numbers weren't destiny. Marcus flexed his fingers once, twice, then rested them lightly on keys that probably cost more than his apartment building. The judge with the clipboard cleared his throat. "Begin when ready," he said, not looking up from his notes. Marcus closed. His eyes for half a second heard the rattle of the laundromat washing machines in his head like a strange metronome, and played the first note. The room went quiet when Marcus answered. Director Petrov's fountain pen stopped halfway through writing. "Let me understand," he said, tilting his head. "You learned Rachmaninoff's Third on a 61-key keyboard?" Marcus felt the weight of the judge's stares. The community center's piano had missing high notes and a dead pedal, but he'd never named those flaws aloud until now. One of the evaluators, a woman with silver hair, leaned over to whisper to her colleague. Marcus knew what they were thinking. No proper arpeggios. No full chord voicings. 27 absent keys meant entire passages had to be rearranged or imagined. He'd practiced the workarounds in his head for months. During slow afternoons at the laundromat, his fingers would twitch against his thighs, mapping out the missing octaves. On the bus rides home, he'd hum the bass lines that his keyboard couldn't produce. The sticky middle C had taught him to play through mistakes, Sometimes the note would wheeze instead of sing, clinging to the felt like it didn't want to let go. Petrov capped his pen with a soft click. That's like learning to box with one hand tied behind your back. A chuckle drifted from the back of the room. Marcus kept his shoulders square. He'd heard worse from the kids at school when they spotted him carrying sheet music instead of a basketball. The director leaned forward, elbows on the polished table. Tell me truthfully, how many complete performances have you managed on a real piano before today? Marcus looked at the Steinway in the corner. Its lid was propped open like an invitation, or a trap. None, sir. Someone coughed. Petrov's eyebrows lifted. You're telling me your first encounter with all 88 keys will be during your audition? A phone buzzed on the table. No one reached to silence it. Marcus flexed his hands, remembering the way calluses had formed unevenly from practicing on stiff, unweighted keys. The keyboard I have lets me practice the parts that fit, he said. The rest, I hear them. Petrov sat back, exchanging a look with the silver-haired judge. Marcus caught the word unprecedented, muttered under someone's breath. The director picked up Marcus's application again, scanning the section about his training. Rachmaninoff wrote this concerto to showcase the full range of a concert grand, he said. Every note serves a purpose. What makes you think you can do it justice on half an instrument? Marcus studied his shoes, scuffed from the walk through, the conservatory's marble halls still damp from the morning rain. He thought of his mother staying up after double shifts to listen to him rehearse the same measures over scratchy YouTube recordings. Of the nights their building super banged on the wall because the keyboard's volume control was broken. He lifted his head. Missing keys doesn't mean missing music, sir. Just different ways to find it. Petrov considered him for another moment before gesturing to the piano. Well then, Mr. Chen, let's hear what your creative solutions sound like. Marcus crossed the room, the parquet floor cool under his thin soles. The Steinway's bench was higher than he expected. As he sat, his reflection blinked back at him from the piano's glossy surface. A boy in a too large blazer surrounded by gleaming wood and gold leaf trim. He played middle C first, testing. The note bloomed under his finger, rich and clear, nothing like the tinny echo of his practice keyboard. For half a second, panic gripped him. This instrument responded to the slightest pressure, while his fingers were hardened from pounding reluctant keys. He curled his hands, exhaled, and began. The opening chords came easier than he'd imagined. His left hand instinctively adjusted its force, compensating for the unfamiliar sensitivity. The piano seemed to lean into his touch, carrying each phrase forward like it had been waiting for him. 3 measures in, Marcus stopped hearing the whispers behind him. He forgot the missing keys, the hole in his shoe, the director's skeptical frown. There was only the weight of the music, and the astonishing realization that for the first time in his life the piano wasn't fighting back. When he lifted his hands, the silence in the room had changed. No one coughed. The silver-haired judge's pencil lay abandoned on her score sheet. Petrov's chair creaked as he shifted forward, but Marcus kept his eyes on the keyboard. The keys gleamed under the stage lights, everyone present, everyone waiting. Proceed, the director said quietly. Marcus placed his hands on the keys again, and this time he didn't hesitate. The apartment always smelled faintly of detergent, even after Elena Chen opened all the windows. Marcus watched her count out the audition fee in small bills on the kitchen table. She'd worked 14 night shifts at the hospital to pay for this. He knew because he'd been keeping tally on the calendar behind his sheet music. The crisp $20 bills contrasted with her cracked hands, still red from chemical cleaners despite the lotion she applied religiously. Their building's radiator hissed as Elena handed Marcus his breakfast, 2 hard-boiled eggs she'd cooked before. Her shift. Eat slow, she said, though normally she'd tell him to hurry before the bus came. Today she was letting him skip school for the scholarship audition. Marcus split 1 yolk with his fork. He'd seen the notice his mother tucked under her pillow last week. The landlord's warning scribbled in red marker across the top. Research shows low-income families spend 34% more of their household income on arts education than wealthier households proportionally. Elena had sold her wedding band to pay for Marcus's first month of lessons with Mr. Rodriguez. The gold band bought exactly 3 sessions and a used metronome missing its cover. Elena zipped Marcus's jacket up to his chin, her fingers lingering on the collar she'd starched 5 times to get the stiffness right. The shirt underneath was his only button-down, bought 3 sizes too big so he could wear it until graduation. Someone had donated it to the church clothing drive with the tag still attached. Elena had altered the sleeves herself, stitching them shorter while watching YouTube tutorials. "Play like home hears you," she whispered. Neither mentioned she wouldn't be riding the bus with him. She couldn't afford to miss even one cleaning shift. Marcus felt the folded bus transfer in his pocket, already damp from his nervous hands. The return ticket was conspicuously absent. If he didn't get the scholarship, he'd have to walk the 7 miles back. Marcus looked past his mother's shoulder to the kitchenette. The Rachmaninoff sheet music lay next to the rice cooker, its pages covered in pencil marks. He'd spent 2 months' allowance on it after discovering the piece in an old CD from the library. Elena had cooked dinner standing up that whole week. The stool was gone, sold to a neighbor when the electricity bill came due. They stepped into the hallway where the scent of detergent gave way to mildew. The elevator hadn't worked in 6 years, so they took the stairs past chipped tile and exposed wiring. Mrs. Wu from 3B was washing her vegetables in the shared sink on the landing. "Big day?" she asked, eyeing Marcus's stiff collar. Elena smoothed Marcus's cowlick down for the 7th time that morning. Her fingernails, usually neatly trimmed for hospital sanitation standards, had ragged edges this week. She'd been unraveling an old sweater to knit Marcus gloves for winter, picking at the seams during her lunch breaks. At the bus stop, Elena hugged Marcus tighter than usual. The sharp scent of disinfectant clung to her scrubs. Her embrace lasted 3 full breaths before she pulled back to study his face. "Remember," she said, "the piano doesn't know what neighborhood you're from." The bus arrived with a squeal of brakes. Marcus climbed the steps without looking back, knowing she'd wait until he couldn't see her anymore to wipe her eyes. The conservatory's grand facade loomed 20 bus stops later. Marcus walked past bronze plaques listing donors with 6-figure contributions. His dress shoes, polished thrift store finds, clicked unevenly on the marble steps. One sole was splitting near the toe, but Elena had stuffed cardboard inside to hide it. When his turn came, Marcus thought of his mother's hands, pressing his audition clothes the night before. The iron had left shiny patches on the trousers where she'd lingered too long trying to erase creases. He imagined her at that moment, pushing a mop down hospital corridors while simultaneously glancing at the wall clock. She'd be counting the minutes until he should finish playing, if they allowed him the full time. The piano bench was colder than Marcus expected through his thin slacks. He flexed his fingers once, seeing not the gleaming Steinway before him but the community center's battered keyboard, the one with the G key that sometimes stuck unless you hit it at exactly the right angle. The instrument he'd learned on during the 2 free hours each week when the after-school program let him stay late. Marcus placed his hands on the keys. The weight of every missed meal, every bleach-scrubbed uniform, every silent bus ride home settled into his shoulders. He could still smell the detergent clinging to his shirt collar. Somewhere across town, Elena was surely stopping mid-mop to stare at nothing, sending all her hope across the city like a silent prayer. He inhaled sharply through his nose, detergent, wood polish, his own nervous sweat, and began to play. Marcus adjusted the piano bench, his palms damp against the wood. Director Petrov leaned over to murmur something to the silver-haired judge, who covered her mouth to suppress a smile. The other applicant still waiting near the door, a boy in a navy sweater with embroidered initials, snorted audibly. "If this boy can actually play," Petrov announced loud enough for the entire room to hear, "I'll kneel right here." He gestured to the marble floor beside the Steinway. Laughter bubbled up from the judges' table. One of them pretended to cough into his sleeve. Marcus felt the heat spread from his collar to his ears. The director's challenge turned what should have been a private audition into theater. Petrov settled back in his chair, arms crossed over his designer suit. His gold cufflinks caught the light each time he tapped a finger against his elbow. Later, Judges would admit they'd never seen Petrov stake his reputation so publicly. In 23 years as director, he'd built the conservatory's prestige by rejecting unpolished candidates, those lacking proper training, proper instruments, proper pedigree. His approval could launch careers. His skepticism crushed hopes. Before the first note sounded, Marcus flexed his fingers under the piano lid where no one could see. The familiar motion grounded him. He remembered practicing during that brutal week last January when the community center's heater failed. His breath had hung in clouds over the keyboard as he played scales to keep warm. Tonight his mother would work the overnight hospital shift again, her hands raw from cleaning chemicals, while he, the polished Steinway surface reflected his, face back at him, distorted slightly by the curve of the wood. Marcus watched his own too short sleeves hike up bony wrists as he positioned his hands. The blazer had been bought second-hand 3 years ago, elbows shiny from wear. Petrov cleared his throat pointedly. The clock above the door ticked through 5 excruciating seconds. Marcus knew what they all saw, a skinny kid from the wrong eye, side of town with unevenly trimmed hair who'd trained on a half-sized keyboard. Their smirk said it all before he'd played a note. He inhaled slowly through his nose. Detergent from his laundered shirt mingled with the scent of lemon wood polish. Somewhere in the building cafeteria, expensive coffee brewed for faculty who'd never missed a meal to pay for sheet music. Marcus touched middle C first. The note vibrated up through his fingertips, pure and resonant. So different from the community center's keyboard with its dead keys and rattling pedals. He played the opening triad softly, testing the waters. Petrov's cufflinks stopped moving. The second chord came stronger. Marcus's left hand remembering every winter afternoon spent translating Rachmaninoff's demanding bass lines to a keyboard missing its lowest octave. He'd compensated by doubling certain notes, by mentally filling, in the gaps during silent practice sessions on his apartment's kitchen table. Someone in the back row shifted in their seat. The fabric rustle sounded like the pages of sheet music turning at the library, where Marcus had first discovered classical scores. He'd photocopied them 10 cents a page until the librarian started saving discards for him. The concerto's first rapid passage approached. Marcus's pulse jumped, but his fingers knew the way. They'd navigated these same runs countless times on sticky keys that sometimes failed to rebound. The Steinway responded effortlessly, each note crisp and bright. For the first time, Marcus realized how heavily he'd been pressing on practice keyboards to make the sound carry. A measure later, his pinky struck a wrong note. The mistake rang through the room like a gunshot. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd learned early that stopping only drew more attention to errors. Instead, he leaned into the next phrase, letting the music sweep forward. Petrov uncrossed his arms. His chair creaked as he sat up straighter. Marcus's right hand flew through a cascade of 16th notes that had taken him 3 months to master on the unweighted keyboard. Now the Steinway's perfectly balanced action made the passage feel almost easy. His fingers remembered the cold nights practicing until his joints ached, the mornings waking to stiff hands that refused to uncurl. The judging panel had gone still. No shuffling papers, no whispered commentary. Even the clock's ticking seemed muted beneath the swelling music. Marcus played through the exposition, into the development section where the harmonies darkened. He thought of his mother's exhausted face this morning, of the fear behind her encouragement. Then came the treacherous cadenza, the part that broke most students in auditions. Marcus had practiced it slowly for weeks, building speed incrementally, while Mr. Rodriguez tapped time on the piano's scratched surface. His shoulders relaxed fractionally as his hands found their places. The arpeggios spiraled upward, crystal clear in the hushed room. Someone inhaled sharply when he landed the final diminished chord with perfect precision. For the first time since sitting down, Marcus risked a glance at the judges. Petrov's mouth had gone slightly slack. The silver-haired woman gripped her pencil so tightly her knuckles whitened. Marcus turned back to the keys. The concerto's lyrical second theme emerged under his fingers, tender where the opening had been stormy. He leaned into the melody, shaping each phrase as if he could pour every laundromat shift, every missed dinner, every subway ride practicing fingerings on his thigh into the music. The Steinway's sustain pedal caught the overtones, wrapping them around the room like an embrace. Marcus forgot the hole in his shoe. He forgot Petrov's mocking bet. He even forgot the scholarship hanging in the balance. All that remained were the keys under his hands and the certainty that no one in this gilded room, least of all the director, had expected beauty to emerge from such an unlikely place. Marcus's fingers sank into the Steinway's keys with unexpected ease. The weighted action required half the pressure he'd grown accustomed to on the community center's stiff keyboard. For a disorienting moment, he nearly overplayed the first chord before catching himself. The piano responded to his lightest touch, though, stark contrast to the instrument back home that demanded brute force to produce any volume. Concert grands like this one have action mechanisms nearly 30% heavier than practice keyboards, designed to give professionals more control. Yet to Marcus, they felt feather-light. His hands, calloused from years of pounding unresponsive keys, initially struggled to adjust. The opening arpeggio came out uneven, some notes booming while others whispered. He compensated mid-phrase, drawing back his wrists slightly the way he'd seen in those grainy YouTube tutorials he watched on library computers. His left pinky, the one with the crescent-shaped scar from when he'd caught it in a laundromat folding machine, brushed across a delicate passage. The Steinway's smooth ivory made the legato connection effortless. No dead spots to navigate like on his usual keyboard. Marcus remembered practicing this same phrase for weeks, adapting when 3 keys near the bass register wouldn't sound properly. Now the full rich tones vibrated up through the bench and into his shoes, a physical sensation he'd only ever imagined. The first difficult passage approached. Marcus inhaled sharply through his nose. The scent of lemon polish mixed with something earthy, maybe the piano's internal felt dampers. Hundreds of hours on inferior instruments had trained him to anticipate resistance, to muscle through technical sections. This piano required finesse instead of force. For 3 terrifying seconds he faltered, fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys. Then muscle memory took over. His hands found the cascading thirds despite never having played them on a full-sized piano before. The YouTube videos had shown him the proper fingering. Mr. Rodriguez had corrected his wrist positioning. Now the Steinway rewarded these patient preparations, each note ringing true underneath fingers that once struggled to span an octave on that battered practice keyboard. Marcus leaned into the music as the tempo increased. The piano's responsive. Action allowed nuances he'd only theorized about, subtle dynamic shifts, barely their hesitations between phrases. His right hand executed a rapid scale that would have sounded clunky on the community center's instrument, here flowing like water. The bass notes resonated through the floorboards, their vibrations traveling up through his thin-soled shoes and into his bones. Somewhere behind him, a chair creaked. Marcus barely heard it over the music unfolding under his hands. The nervous tension in his shoulders eased as he crossed into the development section. This was the part he'd practiced most obsessively, the sections Mr. Rodriguez had made him play blindfolded to compensate for the practice keyboard's missing high register. His thumb grazed a black key, smooth ebony, not the chipped plastic he knew so well. The difference startled him momentarily before he recovered. Marcus adjusted his seating position slightly, feeling the bench's upholstery through his thrift store slacks. The piano's sustain pedal responded instantly to his foot, no lag-like. The sticking pedal he'd fixed with paper clips and rubber bands. A particularly demanding chord progression loomed. Marcus's fingers tensed in anticipation of the struggle they'd always faced on lesser instruments. When they connected with the Steinway's flawless mechanism, the notes rang out with startling clarity. The overtones blended in ways Marcus had only heard on recordings, filling the high ceilings of the audition room. He forgot about the judges watching. Forgot about Petrov's mocking bet. Even forgot about the hole in his shoe exposing one sock to the polished floor. The music became everything. The give of the keys under his fingers, the way the dampers lifted precisely when needed, the faint, metallic shimmer of the strings vibrating behind the polished mahogany. That stubborn pinky found its mark again, this time in a rapid octave passage. The scar tissue that sometimes hindered his reach on stiff keys now proved no obstacle. Marcus navigated the tricky fingering smoothly, remembering those winter nights when he'd practiced without heat, blowing on his hands between phrases to keep the joints limber. 3 months ago, he'd played this same section on the community center's keyboard for Mrs. Alvarez after school. "You're fighting the instrument," she'd observed. Now Marcus understood what she meant. The Steinway didn't need to be conquered, only listened to. The exposition built toward its climax, each measure more assured than the last. Marcus barely registered the growing quiet in the room. The way, even the judge's breathing seemed to synchronize with the music's pulse. The piano had become an extension of his hands, responding to intentions rather than commands. At the precise moment the concerto's mood shifted from stormy to lyrical, Marcus felt something click into place. His shoulders dropped. His breathing steadied. The remaining technical challenges melted away as the music took control, carrying both him and his listeners forward. The bass notes resonated deeper now, their vibrations traveling up through the bench and into his spine. Marcus barely needed to glance at his hands. They knew this landscape intimately, despite never having walked it before. That hard-won familiarity with imperfect instruments had somehow prepared him perfectly for this moment, with a flawless one. Someone's pencil hit the floor with a faint clatter. The sound didn't interrupt Marcus's flow. If anything, it anchored him back to the present moment without disrupting the music. He was vaguely aware of Petrov leaning forward in his chair, elbows on the judging table. The final cadence approached. Marcus's hands moved with certainty now, shaping each phrase as though he'd been born playing this particular piano. All those hours on inferior instruments hadn't been a handicap after all. They'd forced him to internalize the music so completely that transitioning to a better piano felt like removing weights before a race. When the last notes faded, there was no triumphant flourish, no dramatic pause. Marcus simply lifted his hands from the keys the way he always did at the community center, gently, giving the faint resonance time to breathe. The silence that followed felt different than before. Charged. Alive. The room's stale air had changed during those 20 minutes. What began as skepticism had transformed into something quieter, more contemplative. Marcus looked down at his hands resting on the Steinway's keyboard, the same hands that had once struggled to reach an octave, now effortlessly spanning tenths, across ivory that gleamed under the stage lights. Petrov's chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. Marcus kept his eyes on the piano, studying the reflection of the chandelier in its polished surface. He didn't need to turn around to sense the shift behind him, the weight of the moment pressing down heavier than any piano key ever could. Marcus's hands moved across the keyboard like they'd been shaped for this music. The stormy opening of Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto required precision most professionals spent years mastering. Yet each note came clean and exact from his fingers, a fact that made Dr. Mitchell's pencil hover motionless over her scoring sheet. She blinked once, slowly, then lowered it to the table. Most pianists study this concerto for at least 3 years before attempting a full performance. Marcus had learned it in 7 months on a keyboard missing octaves, watching performances, on Mrs. Alvarez's cracked laptop screen during lunch breaks. The computer's speakers had buzzed during loud passages, but he'd memorized every phrase anyway. His left hand stretched effortlessly to reach tenths, a genetic gift that had gone unnoticed until Mr. Rodriguez spotted it during scales. Even now, Marcus didn't think about the span. He simply pressed the distant keys and trusted his fingers to find them, same as he'd done on the community center's narrowed keyboard. The music shifted from turbulent to lyrical. Marcus's calloused fingertips, still rough from laundromat work, produced a singing tone that made Petrov lean forward in his chair. The contrast shouldn't have been possible. Those hands that hauled laundry bags upstairs now coaxing whispers from the Steinway. Marcus approached the treacherous cadenza. He'd practiced this section more than any other, knowing it broke most students during auditions. At home, he'd drilled it slowly while his mother slept between hospital shifts, muting the keyboard with a towel when the hour grew late. Now the runs came effortlessly, each note placed with exacting care. Someone gasped when he navigated the most difficult passage flawlessly. Marcus barely heard it. He was too busy remembering the YouTube tutorial he'd watched 19 times, the one where the pianist explained how to redistribute chords between hands. That single video had solved a problem months of frustration couldn't crack. The glare from the overhead lights caught the sweat on his forehead. Marcus blinked it away, focusing on the reflection of his hands in the piano's polished surface. The image rippled slightly with each movement, like watching himself play underwater. He'd reached the cadenza's climax. The dissonant chords that gave most students trouble rang out with startling clarity under his fingers. Marcus didn't rush them the way he sometimes had during practice. Here, with a piano that actually responded, he could take exactly the time the music required. Dr. Mitchell's score sheet remained blank where she should have been marking deductions. The other judges had stopped pretending to take notes entirely. Only Petrov kept writing, his pen moving rapidly now, but not in the margins where corrections belonged. His notes filled the main space, paragraph after paragraph. Marcus's foot worked the sustain pedal with precision born from years compensating for a broken one. The community center's pedal had required triple the pressure to engage halfway. This piano responded to the lightest touch, letting him layer harmonies in ways he'd only imagined before. The music built toward another storm passage. Marcus's shoulders stayed loose despite the increasing demands. Those endless hours practicing on unweighted keys had built stamina now serving him well. Where others might tire fighting the Steinway's heavier action, he found it almost effortless by comparison. A sudden wrong note would have derailed most performers. When Marcus hit one, he simply folded it into the phrase like Mr. Rodriguez had taught him. Mistakes only exist if you act surprised, his teacher always said. The recovery was so seamless, even the judges missed it. The lyrical theme returned, transformed now with darker harmonies. Marcus shaped it differently this time, leaner, more urgent. He remembered watching a master class where the instructor spoke about playing the silence between notes. At the time, he hadn't understood. Now he did. His left hand arpeggios sparkled where they'd once sounded labored. The Steinway's flawless regulation revealed nuances his practice keyboard had concealed. The same passages that once required brute force now yielded to subtle shifts in wrist position. Marcus approached the final virtuosic run. Every muscle remembered practicing this until his hands cramped, first slowly, then building speed week by week. The community center's custodian used to joke about his stubbornness when finding him still there at closing time. The notes poured out perfectly timed, perfectly balanced. No hesitation, no forcing. Just pure momentum carrying him upward through the scales to the final ringing chord. When the last vibration faded, the silence felt heavier than before. Someone's phone hit the floor with a clatter no one acknowledged. Marcus kept his hands hovering over the keys a moment longer, listening to the Steinway's faint aftersound, something his practice instrument never produced. His reflection in the piano lid showed damp hair sticking to his forehead. Behind it, distorted by the curve of the wood, he could just make out Petrov's face. The director wasn't smiling. Wasn't frowning either. Just staring at the space between Marcus's hands and the keyboard like he was seeing something impossible. Marcus lowered his aching hands to his lap. The scent of piano wax and his own nervous sweat mixed strangely in his nose. Somewhere outside this room, his mother was halfway through her hospital shift, oblivious to what had just happened. Somewhere, Mr. Rodriguez was probably tuning that awful community center piano, never expecting to hear this news. The judges' chairs creaked as they shifted. No one spoke. Marcus watched a dust mote drift through a shaft of light above the piano, realizing he hadn't noticed daylight coming through the high windows until now. His hoodie, draped over a chair in the corner, suddenly looked out of place, a stain of dull gray in this gleaming room. Petrov cleared his throat. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the held breath quiet. Marcus wondered if this was when they'd ask about his training again, or comment on how someone like him couldn't possibly sustain this level consistently. Instead, the director's chair scraped back violently. Marcus turned just in time to see the proud man drop to his knees on the marble floor. The impact echoed faintly through the silent room. Marcus didn't hear the clock anymore. Between one measure and the next, its steady ticking vanished from his awareness. The judge's pens, the murmur of HVAC vents, even Petrov's conspicuous bet, all faded behind the music unfolding under his hands. His focus narrowed to the space between piano keys and fingertips, where every vibration traveled up through his arms and into his chest. Neuroscience would later explain what happened in that room. Expert musicians enter flow states, 73% faster than amateurs, their brains shifting into a unique pattern of alpha and theta waves. Marcus wouldn't learn those terms until his first conservatory physiology class. He only knew the music had become the only real thing left, more tangible than his threadbare cuffs brushing the keys, more immediate than the hole in his shoe, letting in cold from the marble floor. The second movement began with aching simplicity. Marcus leaned into the melody like he was translating all those silent bus rides home. Every night his mother returned from double shifts with exhaustion in the bend of her spine. The Steinway responded with a warmth his practice keyboard couldn't replicate, its harmonics layering beneath each note like shadows. Across the room, Petrov's arms slowly uncrossed. The motion was barely perceptible, a general lowering his defenses. Marcus's pedal work became instinctive. The sustain caught fleeting harmonies the way Elena Chen once caught falling detergent bottles at the laundromat. Effortless reflexes born from repetition. His left hand shaped phrases without conscious thought, tendons recalling 15 months of adapting Rachmaninoff's demands to an inferior instrument. Now the piano met him halfway, its responsive action removing barriers he hadn't realized existed. A beam of afternoon light slanted across the music rack. Marcus blinked against the glare but didn't falter. Somewhere beyond the windows, city. Buses groaned to stops and office workers hurried to lunch. None of it penetrated the sanctuary built measure by measure. The music swelled gently, carrying him toward the technical run that had taken 2 months to conquer. At the community center, he'd played this passage cautiously, compensating for the keyboard's inconsistent action. Here the Steinway's precision let him attack at full force. His fingers flew across thirds with an accuracy that surprised even him. The strings vibrated cleanly behind the polished mahogany, none of the metallic buzz that plagued his practice sessions. He barely registered the small sigh from one of the judges. Marcus's pulse steadied despite the increasing demands. Months of playing through chill-blained fingers in that unheated community room had built endurance now serving him in this air-conditioned splendor. The piano's slow movement gave way to quicker passages seamlessly, like chapters in a story he knew by heart. His calloused fingertips, still rough from helping with laundry, produced a singing tone that made Petrov lean forward slightly. The high register sparkled under Marcus's touch. These were the keys his practice instrument lacked entirely, forcing him to transpose certain passages down an octave. Now they rang out with bell-like clarity, perfectly balanced against the middle and bass registers. He adjusted his touch instinctively, recalling the exact pressure needed for each dynamic marking, knowledge earned from squinting at YouTube tutorials on a cracked phone screen. As the music built toward its climax, Marcus stopped thinking entirely. His body remembered what to do. The final run approached, a cascade of notes that had once seemed impossible. He drilled it relentlessly on that sticky practice keyboard until his hands cramped, repeating it first slowly, then gradually quicker, until muscle memory took over. Now it unfolded effortlessly, his fingers finding their places without hesitation. The last chord hung in the air longer than seemed possible. Marcus kept the pedal depressed, letting the Steinway's rich overtones vibrate through the silent room. His hands hovered above the keys for 3 full breaths before lowering to his lap. The quiet around him felt different now, not judgmental like when he'd first entered, but charged with something heavier. No one coughed. No chair creaked. Even the building's usual ambient noises had gone still. Marcus looked down at the piano lid's reflection and saw distorted shapes moving, judges shifting positions, someone lowering a clipboard to the table. Then came the sound no one expected. A sharp intake of breath followed by something heavy, hitting marble. Marcus turned just enough to see Director Petrov on his knees beside the piano bench, One hand braced against the Steinway's leg for balance. The man's polished Oxford shoes scraped against the floor as he adjusted his position slightly. His tie had come loose at some point during the performance, the silk knot now resting crooked against his collar. Marcus watched as Petrov's shoulders rose and fell visibly. The director kept his face turned downward, but the light from the windows caught something shiny on his cheeks. Behind him, Dr. Mitchell had frozen halfway through raising her water glass. The other judges sat perfectly still, not clapping, not writing notes, just existing in the charged silence. Somewhere beyond the conservatory walls, a siren wailed faintly. City sounds crept back in through the high windows, honking cars, a distant jackhammer. Normal life resuming around this frozen moment. Marcus flexed his fingers absently, feeling the dull ache of exertion mixed with something lighter. The scent of wood polish and his own nervous sweat clung to him as he waited. Petrov's breath hitched audibly when he finally spoke. The director's voice, usually so crisp and precise, cracked on the first syllable. He swallowed hard and tried again, this time addressing the floor rather than Marcus. That was... The words trailed off. He lifted his head slightly, revealing red-rimmed eyes that matched his flushed cheeks. Marcus had seen grown men cry before, mostly exhausted night shift workers at the hospital where his mother cleaned. Never someone like Petrov, with his tailored suits and gold cufflinks. The director blinked rapidly, then exhaled through his nose. When he finally looked up at Marcus, his expression held none of the mocking superiority from earlier. Just something raw and unmistakable. "I've taught here 20 years, Petrov said to the space between them. His fingertips pressed against the marble as if testing its solidity. Then quieter. "The most beautiful playing I've ever heard in this room." Dr. Mitchell set her glass down carefully. The faint clink of crystal against wood seemed to break the spell. Other judges stirred like spectators awakening from a shared dream. Someone, Marcus couldn't see who, let out a long, shaky breath behind their scoring sheet. Petrov didn't rise from his knees. He studied Marcus with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. The afternoon shadows had lengthened across the floor without anyone noticing, stretching toward them both like silent witnesses. Marcus realized distantly that his own breathing had slowed to match the director's, unconsciously synchronized in the aftermath. The clock began ticking again. Its familiar sound cut through the lingering vibrations of the last chord. Petrov's cufflinks flashed as he wiped at his face with one sleeve. The motion was quick, practiced, someone used to recovering from public displays. But when his hands dropped back to his sides, his fingers trembled noticeably. Silence stretched between them for 3 more heartbeats. Then Petrov reached into his suit pocket and withdrew a folded document Marcus recognized instantly, the scholarship application form they'd mailed in 6 weeks earlier. The director smoothed it against the marble with both hands before looking up with an expression Marcus had never seen aimed at him before. Not pity, not tolerance. Something far more dangerous. Respect. Petrov's knees hit the marble before Marcus could fully rise from the piano bench. The director landed hard, one hand grasping the Steinway's leg for balance. His crisp suit pants wrinkled against the floor, the same pants that had looked so pristine when he'd laughed at Marcus's worn shoes earlier. Now they bore scuff marks from the impact. Marcus had seen grown men cry before, mostly night shift workers slumped outside the hospital where his mother cleaned. But never someone like Petrov with his gold cufflinks and perfect posture. The man's shoulders trembled slightly under his tailored jacket, the motion barely perceptible until you noticed how his fingers dug into the piano's polished wood. That was... Petrov's voice cracked. He swallowed hard, staring at the space between Marcus's hands and the keyboard. Studies show elite music judges recognize genuine talent within 30 seconds of performance. Petrov had needed less. Marcus watched the director's reflection warp in the Steinway's curved surface. The man's face looked different upside down, older somehow with lines Marcus hadn't noticed before. A single tear tracked down Petrov's cheek and dripped onto the conservatory's pristine floor. Marcus saw himself mirrored in that fallen droplet for half a second before it soaked into marble. I've taught here 20 years, Petrov said to the ground. His polished Oxford shoes had lost their shine against the dull floor. Behind him, Dr. Mitchell and the other judges stood slowly, not applauding, simply rising from their chairs like witnesses at a vigil. Their score sheets lay forgotten on the table, pencils rolled to the edges. The clock above the door ticked through 10 strained seconds. Petrov's breathing sounded uneven, the way Marcus's father used to breathe after long shifts at the factory before he left. The director wiped his face with one sleeve, a quick, practiced motion that didn't quite hide the shaking. Marcus flexed his fingers in his lap. They still smelled faintly of the laundromat, despite hours of practice at the community center. The scent mixed oddly with the piano's lemon wood polish. He remembered Petrov's mocking challenge, the laughter when director said he'd kneel if Marcus could play. No one was laughing now. Petrov gripped the piano legs tighter, his knuckles whitening. Marcus could see the man's distorted reflection in the Steinway's black gloss, eyes red-rimmed, mouth working silently before he spoke again. The most beautiful playing I've ever heard here. Dr. Mitchell reached for the scholarship. Papers. The sound of rustling documents broke whatever spell had fallen over the room. Petrov inhaled sharply through his nose and blinked several times fast. When he stood, his knees cracked audibly. Marcus hadn't moved from the bench. His sock poked through the hole in his shoe where it pressed against the pedal. He became suddenly aware of how quiet the building was. No students practicing in distant rooms, no voices in the hall. Just the faint hum of the air conditioning and Petrov's slowing breath. The director straightened his tie with fingers that still trembled slightly. His cufflinks caught the light when he brushed at his jacket sleeves, wiping away invisible. A dust. Marcus noticed a faint bleach stain on Petrov's shirt sleeve where his cleaning staff must have overdone it. Judges made small shuffling noises behind their table. Someone cleared their throat but didn't speak. Petrov kept staring at Marcus with an expression that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite awe. Something raw in between those two. Marcus thought of his mother's hands on her hospital mop, raw from disinfectant. He thought of Mr. Rodriguez, stopping his community center lessons early last winter because the space heater broke again. Mostly, he thought of the director's voice cracking when he said, "Beautiful." The scholarship papers made another soft rustle as Dr. Mitchell slid them toward Petrov. The director took them without looking, his eyes still locked on Marcus. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows, turning Petrov's tears to gold streaks on his cheeks. "Full tuition," Petrov said, his voice steadier now. "Housing. Private mentorship." He swallowed again. "Ordinarily we'd debate this, but—" He gestured at the silent judges, all still standing awkwardly behind their table. No one contradicted him. Marcus looked down at his hands. The calluses felt rough against his thighs. He wondered if Petrov knew those hands had scrubbed laundry detergent spills off apartment floors, had fished coins from washing machine slots at closing time. Probably not. Petrov stepped closer, the scholarship papers gripped tightly in one hand. Up close, Marcus could see the faint scar above the director's eyebrow, the expensive haircut grown out just enough to show gray roots. A man accustomed to perfection, now kneeling before imperfection's triumph. "May I?" Petrov gestured to the piano bench. Marcus scooted over slightly, making room. The wood creaked when the director sat, another small crack in his polished facade. For a moment they just sat there together, Marcus in his discount store shirt, Petrov in his wrinkled suit. The Steinway stretched before them, its keys still warm where Marcus's fingers had been. Someone coughed politely near the door. Petrov placed the scholarship forms on the music stand carefully, aligning the edges. He uncapped a fountain pen from his pocket. Real gold, Marcus noticed, not fake like the ones at school. The nib hovered over the signature line. Marcus saw his mother's face suddenly, clear as if she stood in the room. The way she'd looked this morning pressing his shirt, her tired eyes saying everything her lips wouldn't. He reached for the pen. Petrov held it out, their fingers brushing briefly before Marcus took it. The metal felt warmer than expected, against his skin. Someone in the back of the room exhaled loudly. Marcus signed carefully, watching his name appear in ink blacker than the piano's polish. The letters looked strange, surrounded by all that official conservatory letterhead. Oak Street's first student breaking onto ivory tower paper. Petrov's cufflinks flashed when he reached to take the documents back. "Welcome," the director said simply, though his voice still sounded ragged around the edges. Marcus nodded once and stood, his holy shoe making no sound on the marble now, just the whisper of fabric as Petrov rose with him. The clock ticked again, louder than before. Somewhere down the hall, a janitor's keys jingled. Everyday sounds, returning to claim the space extraordinary music had briefly occupied. Petrov extended his hand. Marcus hesitated half a second before shaking it, his laundromat-roughened palm against the director's manicured grip. The moment lasted 3 beats longer than necessary before Petrov turned to address the waiting judges. Marcus glanced back at the Steinway one last time. The keys gleamed under the lights, holding their silence like a promise. 30 minutes ago, they'd been strangers. Now their song hummed in his bones. His sock still poked through his shoe when he walked away. Petrov remained on one knee when he spoke, his dress pants wrinkling against the marble. Housing, meals, books, all covered. The fountain pen in his hand was worth more than Marcus's entire audition outfit. His voice sounded different now, not the crisp diction from before, but something softer around the edges. These words meant Marcus would never have to choose between lunch money and photocopied sheet music again. Elena Chen stood in the back, row near the exit, hands pressed to her mouth. She must have come straight from her hospital shift. Marcus spotted the bleached collar of her uniform beneath the old coat she only wore for special occasions. Her eyes looked red even from across the room. Top conservatories like this awarded full scholarships to just 2% of applicants, mostly competition winners with years of private training, not kids who practiced on broken keyboards during laundromat shifts. Petrov hesitated before adding, "and private mentorship." A murmur rippled through the judging panel. That privilege usually went to international competition winners, not first-time auditionees. The director's cufflinks flashed as he extended the scholarship papers toward Marcus. The fountain pen trembled, slightly in his grip, not from doubt but from leftover adrenaline. Marcus thought of Mr. Rodriguez at the community center right then, how the old man would react when he heard. That battered piano Marcus had practiced on for 3 years would finally get its replacement. The memory of sticky keys and missing octaves flashed through his mind like footage from another life. The pen felt unexpectedly heavy when Marcus took it, heavier than any piano key he'd ever pressed. His signature would change everything. Not just for him, but for his mother counting bus fare in the back row, for Mr. Rodriguez's next student, maybe even for kids at Oak Street who'd never seen the inside of a place like this. Petrov pointed to the signature line, his manicured nail tapping the crisp paper. The scholarship terms included everything: dormitory housing, meal plan, even pocket money for metronome batteries. Marcus gripped the pen tighter. His hand still hummed from the performance, fingers remembering the exact resistance of the Steinway's keys compared to his practice instrument. The ink flowed smoother than expected. Marcus watched his name appear in dark strokes against the official conservatory letterhead. Oak Street's first student accepted into this world. Elena made a small sound near the door, quickly muffled. Petrov exhaled sharply when Marcus finished signing, as if he'd been holding his breath. 3 months later, the scholarship letter still hung on their apartment fridge, held up by a laundry magnet. Marcus's new life took shape in ways he couldn't have imagined during those endless practices at the community center. His assigned dorm room had soundproofing that muffled even the loudest scales. The dining hall served food whenever he wanted it, no calculating costs or skipped meals. The conservatory's practice pianos never stuck or missed notes. Marcus still caught himself pounding the keys too hard at first, unused to instruments that responded to light touches. Petrov left handwritten notes in the margins of his sheet music now, not corrections, but suggestions in red pencil. Try less pressure here, or the piano isn't fighting you anymore. Marcus kept his community center keycard even after moving into the dorms. Sometimes he visited just to play the old keyboard again, its limitations strangely comforting. Mr. Rodriguez always had hot cocoa waiting on those days, the cheap powdered, kind that tasted like childhood. The scholarship check for the community center arrived on a Thursday, enough for 2 new pianos and repairs to the heater. Marcus watched Mr. Rodriguez unfold the letter with shaking hands, his glasses fogging up halfway through reading. Someone had taped a copy of Petrov's now famous quote above the music racks. Listen first. Marcus's mother took fewer double shifts now. She'd enrolled in night classes for her teaching certificate, studying at their kitchen table below the framed first paycheck Marcus had earned teaching beginner piano. Sometimes when he visited, he'd find her humming Rachmaninoff off-key while folding laundry, the ancient detergent smell gradually fading from their lives. Petrov kept his mentorship promise. Every Tuesday at 3 p.m. precisely, he listened to Marcus practice in room 214, offering fewer technical corrections than expected. Mostly he asked questions. What did you feel during the cadenza? Or, how would you teach this passage? Once, after a particularly good session, the director confessed he'd never knelt for any student before, not in 23 years. The scholarship fund grew that semester. 3 more need-based slots opened after Marcus's audition video circulated. Petrov personally called each recipient, his famous cufflinks visible in the newspaper photos. Marcus spotted the first Oak Street kid at orientation week, a violinist with Elena's same determined stare and second-hand shoes. Practice rooms no longer intimidated Marcus. His pencil marks covered the conservatory's loaned sheet music now, fingering reminders for passages he'd once feared. Jennifer Morrison from the graduate program sometimes lingered outside his door, listening. One afternoon she knocked to ask if he'd consider a duet collaboration. Marcus kept his old jeans with the knee hole. When doubts crept in, when the imposter syndrome hit harder than expected, he'd run his fingers over that frayed fabric. The scholarship had changed his circumstances, not his hands. Those remained familiar, scarred pinky, calloused fingertips, palms that still smelled faintly of laundry soap no matter how much he washed them. The morning of his first student recital, Marcus found Petrov adjusting the piano bench backstage. The director's cufflinks caught the stage lights as he tested the pedals, the same meticulous check he'd done for international soloists. He didn't mention knees or auditions or broken keyboards, just nodded once and said, "It's ready for you." Back in Oak Street, the community center hosted concerts now. Parents brought kids to hear live piano for the first time, their faces reflecting the same wonder Marcus had felt discovering music on that battered old keyboard. Mr. Rodriguez always saved Marcus's preferred practice time, though these days, he shared it freely with beginners. Elena framed Marcus's first teaching paycheck beside his debut recital program. The glass protected them from laundry dust and cooking grease, though she'd switched to gentler detergents months ago. Sometimes when Marcus visited, she'd pause mid-chore to study those framed milestones, her hands resting lightly on the mop handle like it was a piano no one could take away. Petrov scheduled Marcus's debut with the city orchestra that spring. The program featured Rachmaninoff's Third, of course. Backstage before the performance, the director handed Marcus a new set of sheet music, freshly printed, no photocopies or taped edges. "For next season," Petrov said, then quieter. "I'll be listening." The Steinway on stage gleamed under the lights, its lid raised high. Marcus flexed his hands once before walking out. The hole in his shoe was long gone, but he still felt its phantom presence like an old friend keeping time. Marcus's pencil marks covered the sheet music now, small reminders in the margins where tricky passages required careful fingering. The practice room's thick walls swallowed every wrong note, every hesitation. No one walking past in the hallway could hear his mistakes. It was nothing like the community center with its glass walls and curious onlookers. Jennifer Morrison paused outside the door during his scales. He saw her shadow linger under the crack before moving on. The graduate student had perfect pitch and competition trophies lining her dorm room. Marcus's fingers faltered slightly when he noticed her listening, slipping back into old habits, pressing too hard, anticipating resistance that wasn't there anymore. 85% of scholarship students reported feeling like imposters during their first months at elite conservatories. Marcus understood why. His hands kept remembering the broken sustain pedal at the community center, the way he'd had to compensate for dead keys. Even now, playing flawless scales on a $120,000 Steinway, part of him still braced for disappointment. Petrov's red pencil notes appeared in his music sometimes. "Less force here. You're not fighting it anymore," one comment said beside a Chopin etude. Marcus traced the words with his fingertip, feeling the slight indentations in the paper. The Steinways. Lid stayed permanently open now, no longer intimidating. He'd grown accustomed to its rich, resonant tone, though sometimes he missed the gritty realism of his old keyboard. Preparations for his first student recital occupied most mornings. Marcus worked through Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, focusing on the sections Petrov had circled. His left hand remembered the sticky G sharp from the community center piano, instinctively lifting higher than necessary here. Old habits died hard. The practice room clock ticked softly beneath the music, counting down to performance day. The scent of lemon polish mixed with Marcus's nervous sweat. He wiped his palms on his jeans between takes, leaving faint, damp patches. These jeans had no holes. The scholarship stipend covered basics now, but he kept them anyway. A reminder. When he closed his eyes during rests, he could still smell the laundry detergent from home. Jennifer hesitated outside again one Thursday afternoon. This time, her knock interrupted Marcus mid-phrase. She stood in the doorway clutching violin sheet music, her posture perfect even in casual clothes. "I heard your Saint-Saëns last week," she said. "Would you consider a duet sometime?" The question sounded rehearsed. Marcus wiped his hands again before accepting the music she offered. The pages were crisp and new, nothing like the battered sheets he'd hauled around in his backpack for years. He spotted the challenging runs immediately, passages that would have been impossible on his old keyboard. "I've never played with anyone before," he admitted. Jennifer shrugged. "Me neither, not really." A lie. Marcus had seen the framed ensemble photos on her Instagram, but her fingers tapped nervously against her leg, matching the tempo of his last piece. They agreed to meet Tuesdays at 4. Later that afternoon, the community center's donation check arrived at Marcus's dorm. Mr. Rodriguez had texted him a photo, the amount printed in bold black numbers. Enough for 2 new pianos and repairs to the heating system. Marcus pinned the photo above his desk beside his practice schedule. The numbers made it real in a way the scholarship hadn't. His first teaching paycheck came the next week. Marcus stared at the amount for a full minute before depositing it. More than his mother made in 2 hospital shifts. That evening, he bought her a new winter coat, one without frayed cuffs or loose buttons. She hugged him tighter than usual when he presented it, her hands still smelling faintly of disinfectant. The duet rehearsals with Jennifer started awkwardly. She counted beats differently than Mr. Rodriguez had, using precise metronome clicks instead of foot taps. Marcus's rhythm adjusted gradually. They argued once over articulation in the third movement, then laughed when Petrov appeared suddenly to settle the debate. The director's ruling surprised them both. He sided with Marcus. Practice rooms became less intimidating over time. Marcus stopped jumping when someone listened at the door. Sometimes he left it slightly ajar now, letting the music spill into the hallway. The pencil marks in his sheet music grew fewer as muscle memory solidified. Only the most difficult passages still bore reminders. Winter break approached. Jennifer invited Marcus home to meet her family, her casually affluent references to a lakeside house and grand piano making his chest tighten. He declined politely, citing plans with his mother. Truthfully, he needed to visit the community center, to play their new pianos and thank Mr. Rodriguez in person. The morning of his student recital dawned gray and cold. Marcus dressed carefully in his scholarship-funded suit, the fabric unfamiliar against his skin. Backstage, Petrov adjusted the bench height without being asked, his cufflinks flashing under the work lights. "You'll do fine," he said, which from the director counted as effusive praise. Marcus's hands didn't shake when he walked on stage. The auditorium smelled of wood polish and quiet anxiety. He spotted his mother in the third row, her new coat draped carefully over the seat back. Mr. Rodriguez sat beside her, leaning forward expectantly. The Steinway waited under warm lighting, its lid raised high. Marcus pressed middle C first, testing. The note rang pure and clear. Nothing like the community center's old pianos, yet somehow familiar now. He adjusted the bench slightly, inhaled through his nose, and began. Jennifer listened, from the wings, her violin case at her feet. Marcus caught her nodding along during the lively sections. The audience disappeared measure by measure, leaving only the music and the steady pressure of fingers on keys. He forgot about imposter syndrome, about past sacrifices, about everything, except the next phrase. When the final chord faded, applause erupted surprisingly loud. Marcus stood awkwardly, spotting Petrov clapping near the soundboard. His mother's eyes shone in the stage lights. Mr. Rodriguez whistled through his teeth, a sound Marcus had heard countless times during lessons, now echoing in this fancy hall. Backstage, afterward, Jennifer handed Marcus a cupcake with a tiny piano drawn in frosting. "For the first of many," she said. Marcus saved half to bring home to Elena, carefully wrapping it in a napkin. Petrov appeared with a stack of papers, next semester's repertoire, but simply said, "Well done," before walking away. The community center's new piano arrived the following week. Marcus visited on a snowy afternoon to find Mr. Rodriguez polishing the gleaming ebony finish. "Try it out," the old teacher urged, stepping back. Marcus played the opening measures of Rachmaninoff's Third, the piece that started everything. The keys responded effortlessly, no dead spots or sticky action. A group of kids gathered around the piano, their eyes wide. Marcus recognized their tentative posture, the same way he'd once approached instruments he couldn't afford to touch. He scooted over on the bench and gestured for a gap-toothed girl to join him. "Here," he said, placing her small hands on middle C. "Everybody starts somewhere." Mr. Rodriguez smiled and pulled up another chair. The community center's heater worked perfectly now, filling the room with warm air that carried the sound of scales and laughter out into the winter afternoon. Marcus watched the girl's face light up when she produced her first clean C major scale, her fingers barely spanning the octave. Tomorrow he'd return to the conservatory's pristine practice rooms, but today belonged here. Elena Chen stacked hospital uniforms into neat piles on the kitchen table. Her textbook spread open to a chapter about childhood music education. The apartment smelled faintly of detergent still, though Marcus's scholarship meant she'd cut back to single shifts now. His old keyboard leaned against the wall by the fridge, its keys dusty from disuse. She kept it there for nostalgia, running her fingers along the chipped middle C sometimes while cooking dinner. The framed eviction notice had come down months ago. In its place hung programs from Marcus's conservatory recitals, the thick paper, stiff under her touch when she straightened them each morning. Research suggested only 11% of students from their zip code ever achieved this kind of upward mobility through the arts. Elena hummed the melody from Marcus's last performance while folding towels, the notes wavering off-key but cheerful. Mr. Rodriguez knocked on their door one rainy afternoon, bearing two pieces of news. The community center had received Marcus's donation check, and they were naming a practice room after him. The old teacher's shoes left damp prints on the linoleum as he described the new piano being delivered next week. Elena offered him tea in their two good cups, the ones without chips. She watched his shaky hands grasp the warm ceramic and remembered all those winters he'd let Marcus stay late practicing in the unheated room. Marcus's hands lost their chemical smell that semester. No more detergent residue from helping with laundry, no more bleach streaks on his knuckles. When he visited on weekends, Elena noticed how his fingers moved differently now, more assured, though they still twitched absent-mindedly against his thighs during dinner, tracing invisible scales. His first teaching paycheck arrived in a crisp envelope with the conservatory's embossed logo. Marcus handed it to Elena without comment, the paper warm from being in his pocket during the bus ride home. She stared at the amount for a full minute before speaking. more than she made in 2 weeks of hospital shifts. They'd never had this kind of money before, not even when Marcus's father still lived with them. Elena framed the check beside his first recital program, hanging both where the eviction notice used to be. The glass caught the morning light now instead of reflecting worry. She ran her fingers over the frame's edges sometimes while reheating leftovers, listening to recordings of Marcus's performances on the old CD player they'd salvaged from a thrift store. Petrov scheduled Marcus's debut with the city orchestra that spring. The announcement came via a phone call that made Elena drop her mop in the hospital corridor. She leaned against the wall as the director's precise voice listed details: rehearsal, schedules, dress codes, ticket allotments for family. Marcus would be playing Rachmaninoff's Third again, the piece that started everything. At home, Marcus practiced on the old keyboard for the first time in months. The sticky keys and uneven action felt foreign now after so many hours on conservatory. Steinway's. He played through the concerto's opening measures slowly, remembering how these limitations had once shaped every technical decision. The sound was tinny compared to what he was used to, but Elena stood in the doorway listening until he finished, her hands still damp from washing vegetables. Mr. Rodriguez visited again before the big performance, bringing a tie borrowed from his nephew for Marcus to wear. The silk felt slippery under Marcus's fingers as he practiced the knot in the hallway mirror. The old man adjusted it slightly, his breath smelling of peppermints and coffee. "Play like you did at the audition," he murmured, patting Marcus's shoulder. Neither mentioned Petrov's kneeling moment. It had become legend at the community center, where kids now pointed at Marcus's photo beside the new piano. The morning of the concert, Elena dressed carefully in the outfit Marcus had bought. With his teaching money, the blouse draped properly without needing alterations, though she kept smoothing non-existent wrinkles from the fabric. They took a taxi instead of the bus, an extravagance that made Marcus raise his eyebrows but didn't protest. Backstage at the concert hall, Petrov adjusted Marcus's collar without being asked. The director's cufflinks shone under the harsh work lights as he gave last-minute advice Marcus barely heard. The noises beyond the curtain, programs rustling, coughs, the orchestra tuning, seemed both familiar and strange. Marcus flexed his hands, feeling the unfamiliar stiffness of his bow tie against his throat. Elena sat in the front row beside Mr. Rodriguez, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The stage lights reflected off her new glasses when she leaned forward as Marcus walked out. The orchestra stood in unison, a sea of black formal wear and polished instruments waiting for his cue. Marcus bowed slightly before sitting at the grand piano. Its gleaming surface mirrored his crisp suit, a far cry from the audition's frayed cuffs and holey shoes. His fingers found middle C, real ivory this time, not the yellowed plastic of the community center keyboard. The first notes rang out clear and powerful through the hall, perfect acoustics carrying every nuance. Elena didn't realize she was crying until the third movement, when a tear hit the program in her lap. The ink smudged slightly where it landed on Petrov's printed introduction. "A rising star from our own city." Mr. Rodriguez handed her a handkerchief without taking his eyes from the stage, where Marcus's hands flew across the keys with impossible grace. After the final chord, the audience rose as one. Elena stood with them, clapping until her palms stung. Marcus bowed again and again, his face flushed under the spotlights. When the orchestra players shook his hand, first the concertmaster, then each section leader, she saw how their respect looked nothing like Petrov's initial skepticism all those months ago. Back home later, Marcus hung the silk tie carefully in his old closet. His teaching schedule at the conservatory would resume Monday, but tomorrow he planned to visit the community center. The director there wanted him to meet some promising new students, kids who reminded her of Marcus at that age, full of talent and unlikely dreams. Elena reheated leftovers while humming the concerto's lyrical theme. The scent of detergent still lingered faintly in the apartment, though her hands no longer cracked from harsh cleaning chemicals. She set 2 places at the table without needing to calculate costs, the framed paycheck and program catching the light when she passed them. Marcus's old keyboard gathered dust by the fridge, its yellowed keys silent now. But when Elena pressed middle C absent-mindedly while waiting for the microwave, the note rang out surprisingly clear. still slightly flat, sticky when released, but perfectly audible in the apartment that was theirs for as long as they wanted it. Petrov's letter guaranteeing next semester's scholarship lay unopened on the counter, just another piece of mail now rather than a lifeline. The community center's new piano waited under brighter lights than the old one ever had, its bench, already worn slightly from eager students. Marcus would play it tomorrow, demonstrating fingerings for kids whose hands couldn't yet span an octave. For now, though, he sat at Elena's laminate table, eating reheated lo mein from cartons while she quizzed him about the orchestra members' names. The apartment walls, once thin enough to hear neighbors arguing through, now vibrated faintly with recordings of tonight's performance. Elena's off-key humming wove through the music. Not perfect, not polished, but full of quiet joy. The kind of sound that had carried Marcus this far, even when no one else was listening. Petrov sat alone in his office late one evening, Marcus's original application file spread across his desk. The overhead light reflected off the black and white headshot clipped to the top. Marcus's hair slightly uneven, probably cut at home. Petrov traced the edge clumsily with his finger, before flipping to the demographic breakdown page. Numbers didn't lie. 89% rejection rate for applicants from Oak Street's zip code over the past decade. He adjusted his reading, glasses, and checked again. The conservatory's annual talent pipeline report lay open beside Marcus's file, its colorful pie charts incongruous with the stark reality. Petrov's own notes from past adjudications jumped out at him. Phrases like lack of polish and unorthodox training circled certain applications. None mentioned the missing 27 keys on Marcus's practice instrument. None considered that subway trains rattling past apartment windows might affect sostenuto pedaling. His computer screen glowed with paused footage of his own kneeling moment during Marcus's audition. The video had gone viral after a parent uploaded it, 3 million views and climbing. Petrov watched his crisp suit pants wrinkle against marble for the 100th time, noticing details he'd missed before. The way Marcus's sock peeked through, his shoe when pedaling, the faint tremor in his own fingers when extending the scholarship papers. Morning light found Petrov still at his desk, Marcus's file now bristling with sticky notes. He'd cross-referenced every Oak Street applicant from the past 5 years, comparing their audition scores against students from wealthier districts. The disparities glared back at him. Near-identical performances rated lower when paired with community center addresses. His gold cufflinks, gifts from the board after winning a prestigious award, felt suddenly heavy against his wrists. Recommendations filled the margins of the pipeline report. Petrov's handwriting, usually so precise, grew progressively messier as the night wore on. Suggestions for outreach programs, need-based slots, transportation stipends. At the bottom of page 6, underlined twice, audition rooms in underserved neighborhoods quarterly. The clock struck 8 as he stapled the pages together, the sound startling in the silent office. The board meeting convened at 10. Petrov placed Marcus's open file at each seat before taking his own. 12 leather chairs scraped back as members settled in, their expressions ranging from curious to wary. No one mentioned the viral video, though Petrov noticed several glancing at his knees throughout his presentation. Pie charts yielded to individual stories. Sarah Kim rejected last cycle despite perfect pitch. Jamal Washington's application lost in transit twice due to address errors. By noon, 3 new need-based scholarship slots were approved unanimously. The conservatory's first-ever outreach coordinator position passed by a narrower margin. Petrov added both to his performance goals before signing the documents, his fountain pen blotting slightly where he pressed too hard. Marcus's file returned to Petrov's office afterward, now flagged with a bright green tab. Inside, someone, possibly, Dr. Mitchell had paper-clipped a photo of Marcus teaching beginners at the community center last weekend. His hands dwarfed the small child's where they guided hers to middle C. Petrov turned the picture over to find Marcus's neat script. For next year's Oak Street candidates, MC. The phone rang while Petrov was reviewing audition flyer drafts. The designer favored grand piano silhouettes against gold backgrounds, But Petrov kept insisting on simpler designs, black text on bright paper, the kind that would stand out on laundromat bulletin boards. He answered absently, expecting another query about font sizes. "Director Petrov?" The woman's voice sounded hesitant. "My daughter got your letter about the outreach auditions? We live above the bodega on Oak and 7th. Papers rustled in. The background. "She's only 8, but her teacher says..." Petrov reached for a fresh file before she finished speaking. His cufflinks clicked against the desk as he wrote Oak 7th Bodega at the top, underlining it twice. The flyers could wait. For the next 37 minutes, he listened carefully, asking about the girl's favorite pieces and whether she had reliable bus fare for the audition date. Before hanging up, he offered to send a practice keyboard if needed. The conservatory had several older models in storage. Rain dotted the windows as Petrov walked to Marcus's practice room later that afternoon. He paused outside the door, listening to scales he once would have critiqued for minor unevenness. Now he heard only disciplined precision, each note clean despite the snowy morning that probably stiffened Marcus's laundry-scarred hands. The door opened unexpectedly, revealing Marcus blinking in surprise with sheet music under his arm. "Sir?" Petrov straightened his tie. "We've approved 3 new outreach positions," he said without preamble. "I'd like your input on repertoire, for younger students." He hesitated, then added, "Children who might be practicing on limited instruments." Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He stepped aside, holding the door wider. Inside, Petrov noted the community center photo now taped to Marcus's music stand. The same one from his file, edges slightly curled. Pencil markings dotted the currentitude, fingering adjustments for sections Petrov himself had struggled with as a student. They worked through possible audition pieces together, Petrov's gold pen flashing as he jotted notes. At one point, Marcus demonstrated a simplified version of a passage, his hands moving with unconscious grace. Watching him, Petrov remembered something his own mentor once said. "Real teaching begins when we stop hearing only the notes and start listening for the music underneath." Flyers appeared across the city the following week, simple black text on canary yellow paper, impossible to miss. They clung to laundromat bulletin boards between missing pet notices and part-time job listings. Petrov supervised the posting himself in Oak Street, watching as a teen in faded jeans paused mid-load to study the details. The boy's fingers, sorting coins for the dryer, were long and tapered beneath chipped nail polish. Back at the conservatory, Marcus's old audition video played on a loop in the admissions office. New staff members watched it during training, seeing not just Petrov's knees hitting marble, but the moment before, Marcus's hands, rough and improbable, drawing beauty from an instrument never meant for him. That was the real lesson, Petrov insisted whenever giving tours now. Not how to spot polish, but how to recognize potential before it knelt before you. The outreach program's first applicant arrived 2 weeks early for her audition, gripping a tattered binder of photocopied sheet music. Petrov greeted her personally, noting the careful mend on her dress sleeve where the fabric had frayed. When she mentioned practicing on a keyboard missing its sustain pedal, he didn't wince, just nodded and adjusted her file. Her name joined Marcus's in the system, linked by the same Oak Street address that once guaranteed rejection. Marcus stopped by Petrov's office afterwards, 2 coffees in hand. They drank in comfortable silence, watching rain streak the windows. Somewhere beyond the glass, a new crop of applicants was discovering bright yellow flyers in unlikely places. Bus shelters, grocery store bulletin boards, the back walls of dimly lit laundromats. Places arrogance seldom thought to look. Marcus still visits the community center every Thursday. The new piano sits where his old keyboard once did, its polished surface reflecting the repaired ceiling tiles overhead. Kids cluster around when he plays, their sneakers squeaking on the freshly mopped floor. The conservatory's brass plaque hangs by the entrance now. "Listen first." Petrov insisted on installing it himself, his cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted the screws. Marcus's mother hums off-key while folding laundry at home. The eviction notice is long gone. Above the fridge, framed programs and paychecks, gathered dust beside a photo of Petrov kneeling, a reminder that talent hides in unexpected places. The center's second piano arrives next week,